Good morning, everyone. My name is Allison Day, and I'm here to present our midterm briefing on behalf of my team on the work we've been doing with the management of refrigerant banks. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about our client and what we've been asked to do, and then go over what HFCs are and why they're so important. And then I will end with our research so far. So our client is the Natural Resources Defense Council, and of course you all know them as one of the premier environmental nonprofits in the US. They are leaders in lots of environmental issues, including air quality and climate, but they deal with the full spectrum of environmental issues. Since the 1970s, they've been working on refrigerant management, which is timely because some new legislation at the end of 2020 was just passed that will help them advance those advocacy efforts that they've been working on for decades. This new legislation is called the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, or the AIM Act. And the goal of that is to reduce the use of HFC refrigerants by 85% in the next 15 years. And I'll go into detail about what that means later. This bill passed with bipartisan support in Congress and has also received support from the HFC industry. So this presents a great opportunity for managing HFC refrigerants. So where my team comes in is we are doing research to determine best practices for HFC management. And we're going to make recommendations to the NRDC as they inform their own recommendations to give to the US Environmental Protection Agency as they implement this new legislation. So before I go into the other details, I want to take a second to go over some terminology. So HFCs stands for hydrofluorocarbons, and they are a powerful greenhouse gas that's also used as a refrigerant. They are non-ozone depleting substances, which is important to note because HFCs were brought in as refrigerants as the successors to the infamous chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, which were ozone depleting substances. So after the Montreal Protocol, CFCs were phased out and HFCs were brought in to replace refrigerants. But then we soon realized that HFCs were contributing to climate change. So now the move is to go away from HFCs and replace them with some climate-friendly alternative refrigerants. When I talk about the refrigerant bank, what I mean is all the installed HFC refrigerants in the US that we're managing here. HFCs are found in lots of products, but a big part of our scope is concerned with commercial applications of them, so like big commercial cooling systems. And then, so with mitigation approaches, there are two main ones. The first is the bank management, so managing the refrigerant banks. And the second is the phase down. So in our scope, we're mostly concerned with bank management. And that actually complements the phase down that's already going to be happening because of the new legislation. And to highlight the difference a little bit more, phase down has to do with reducing the production and consumption of HFCs, and bank management has to do more with the HFC life cycle and preventing leakages throughout the HFC's life cycle in appliances. So take 1 second more to emphasize how big of a problem HFCs are. Greenhouse gases have a global warming potential, which describes their heat trapping capacity when they're in the atmosphere. So for reference, carbon dioxide has a global warming potential of 1. And HFCs, on the other hand, have a global warming potential in the range of hundreds or thousands. So one HFC molecule can have thousands of times more impact than a molecule of carbon dioxide. To illustrate this a little bit more, a single supermarket can leak 25% of its HFC refrigerants each year. And that leakage has the same impact on our climate as the annual emissions from 400 fossil fuel powered vehicles. So as you can see here, HFCs have an extremely potent greenhouse effect, and their phase out and management of these emissions is essential, especially now. Without proper management, it's predicted that HFC emissions will add an additional 0.5 degrees Celsius warming by 2100. And that's especially scary considering that the goal of the Paris Agreement is to have no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. So if we can manage these cooling systems correctly, we can avoid this massive contribution to climate change. In our research, we wanted to understand the HFC ecosystem a little bit more. So, because we don't think about HFCs generally in refrigeration a lot in our lives, but we're thinking about it a little bit more now because of the logistical issues that we've seen getting super freezers to keep the COVID-19 vaccines cold. So as that illustrates that our society is so reliant on HFCs, and they're really critical to so many things that we just take for granted. So we started by looking at the producers. The biggest producers of HFC are the US and China. And several US-based producers of HFCs are also producing the HFC alternatives, the more climate-friendly alternatives. So they're actually ready for this transition away from HFCs. It just hasn't happened yet because it's such a massive undertaking for the country. As for users, HFCs are used in a lot of different appliances, but 90% of them are used for refrigeration and cooling purposes. And that's mostly for buildings and for vehicles. And there's also some less extensively used applications like for fire suppressants and inhalers. And then for end users, that's everyday people. We mostly come into contact with HFCs in our home air conditioning and the refrigerator in your kitchen. But for our scope, like I said, we're more focused on the commercial uses like supermarket refrigeration. In our research, we were also looking at what other countries are doing to phase down and manage their own HFC banks. So we looked specifically at certain areas in the US. We looked at the European Union and Japan and Australia. We've been doing kind of case studies with them and looking at data and HFC trends from those areas to see the effect of the legislation they've already passed. We've also been talking to experts in the HFC policy field and experts in industry to get that insider perspective. So far, the big takeaways are that refrigerant bank management is a really complex issue, but it is essential. So for example, we found that Australia passed legislation to reduce the imports of HFCs because Australia doesn't actually produce any HFCs of its own. But this legislation didn't address the end of life processes for HFCs. So that's like recycling and reclamation. And as a result, the reclamation rate of HFCs is just a fraction of a percent. So from that, we can see it's clear that if we want good bank management, we need to consider all of the steps in the HFC life cycle. So we've done a lot of research so far, but of course there is more to do. We are interested in looking at what percent of HFCs can be reclaimed instead of using new HFCs. And we also need to interview some more experts to fill in some gaps in the data that we've come across in our research into Japan and the EU. And we also are interested in determining whether or not the US has the physical infrastructure that it needs to be able to handle the phase down of HFCs across the country. For phase 2 of our research, we're asking the question, what can be done about the existing bank in the US, and where specifically can we target interventions in the HFC life cycle? We're going to give our recommendations for these different tasks to the NRDC, and hopefully that will inform what they recommend to the EPA, and all of that will go into helping with this goal of the 85% phase down of HFCs in the next 15 years, and also reduce the HFC contribution to climate change. So HFCs are not usually the first thing that people think about when they think of greenhouse gases, but we've shown here that they are a huge threat to the stability of the climate because of their high global warming potential. But it is great news that this new legislation has been passed, and our work with the NRDC to recommend refrigerant bank management strategies to EPA will hopefully make a big difference in terms of reducing these dangerous emissions, and will help make the transition to climate-friendly alternatives easier. So with that, we are looking forward to sharing our findings with you during the final briefing in April. Thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you. Nice job, Allison. Stephanie will again recognize questioners.
Sure. All right, Sophie, you're up.
Hi, Allison. That was a great presentation. I have a quick question for you. This might just be my lack of knowledge. You mentioned environmentally friendly, like alternatives to the refrigerant. I was just curious if you could provide any examples of what that would be.
Yeah, so HFCs, we said that they have a range, their global warming potential range can be hundreds or 1,000 times more than carbon dioxide. So these alternatives, they still have a higher global warming potential than carbon dioxide, but it's a lot less than what we are currently using now. So I think the cutoff for a low global warming potential alternative is 150. I might be wrong. So if somebody in my group wants to correct me in the chat, that'd be great. But yeah, the goal is to just get it, I think, into triple digits or double digits for the global warming potential.
All right, Tunde, you're up.
Hi, Allison. That was great. I had a quick question about the case studies, the countries that you guys chose to look at, and I was wondering how you guys selected those. Just based, I was just thinking more. This is based on my probably uninformed understanding of the issue, but I would think that the biggest potential for growth in indoor air conditioning is probably in the developing world, just considering how many people are, how incomes and livelihoods are growing in that part of the world. And I would think that maybe that might be a good place to look in terms of if not what they're doing right, but I guess yeah, maybe even what they're doing right there. That seems like a place where there might be an opportunity to learn. I was wondering how you guys picked your case studies.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about the increase in air conditioning in developing countries. But I think our target areas came from our client, because our client was more concerned about the commercial application. So not the home air conditioning, more like grocery store refrigeration aisles. So we were targeting those countries that are really that's where the commercial stuff is happening. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely, yes, thanks.
All right, Colleen, you can ask a question.
Been really, really interesting presentation. Thank you. So I believe, or you may have touched on this, so it's either a clarifying question or just a question based off what you presented. So it's about barriers to transitioning to the let's say, quote unquote, climate friendly refrigerants. Like, what are the barriers? Is it the technology changes to use the new types of refrigerants? Are the cooling properties different? Are there chemical lobbyists involved that if there's something there for the refrigerant manufacturers to lose, should they ramp up production of the quote unquote climate friendly types? So could you elaborate on if it's one of those, which is the biggest barrier, or if it's something I'm not thinking about? If you could elaborate on it, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple barriers. One of them is that not all appliances can use the HFC alternative. So there has to be a little bit of that technical transition there. But in terms of developing the actual alternatives, we have a lot of those already, and a lot of HFC producers already have those alternatives ready to go. So that's why industry has been in support of this transition for a while, actually. I think there was a third part of your question.
I think you answered it. It was just, okay. Yeah, if there's something the manufacturer stand to lose, but I think you answered it sufficiently.
Yeah. Oh, one more thing is that not all HFC manufacturers, that's what I was going to say, not all HFC manufacturers are manufacturing alternatives. So those smaller companies that are manufacturing HFCs for the more specific applications, they're not such a fan of this new requirement to transition. So that's another thing to consider as we make this transition.